Great. So, welcome everybody. I'd just like to introduce our speaker, Jon Nixon, who, just a little quick bio. Jon, I think, calls himself an independent scholar, but he has affiliations to two universities, the Educational University of Hong Kong, and he's a senior research fellow with the Centre for Lifelong Learning Research and Development. I find Jon's work really interesting because it takes theory and applies it to the practices of higher education in a very real way, and I think that movement between theory and practice is a very rich and interesting one. Jon has published a number of works in this area, quite a number of books, which I would strongly suggest visit his website, jon.nixon.com. Is that right? To have a look at those. But just more recently, Gadamer, the Hermeneutical Imagination, Hannah Arendt and the Politics of Friendship, and the book he's currently working on is Rosa Luxemburg and the Struggle for Democratic Renewal. So that will be one on my Christmas list, definitely. What I particularly like about Jon's work is it transcends into the support he gives to other scholars working in the area. So those are the reasons behind inviting him today. So.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me, and it's very nice to be with you all. Thinking of the progress on my Rosa Luxemburg book actually might be a bit premature to order your Christmas list. But it's fun.
Yes.
Yes, please do. I wondered if do any of you feel that you're real Gadamerian scholars, or do any of you use Gadamer in your work?
I've only just discovered it, but I'm coming towards the end of a PhD, and right. I intend to. I'm hoping today I'll be able to do it a bit better.
I certainly haven't. I haven't known Gadamer's work all my life, by any means. In fact, I was a book of mine that came out in 2012 was called Interpretive Pedagogies for Higher Education, and the centrepiece of that were essays on Hannah Arendt, Martha Nussbaum, Edward Said, etc. And I needed a framing device because I was discussing them as interpreters and trying to pull out pedagogy from that. And I found Gadamer tremendously useful as a kind of framing device, so I devoted one of the kind of context-building chapters to that. So I've come across Gadamer fairly recently, but find him very rich. So I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit about his life, say something about what I see as the central themes, then move on to the theme, which is the main theme of the paper, the idea of what method might mean or doesn't mean in Gadamer, and then come out the other end with a few implications of that for professional practice or whatever. If I start going on to automatic pilot and you don't follow me, please just break in and ask me to slow down or explain myself or whatever. Or if anybody has questions on the way, I'm very happy to open it up as we go along. One point which I'm sure I don't need to explain to you is that Gadamer is associated with hermeneutics. Hermes, as you know, was the messenger of the gods, the interpreter between Zeus and Prometheus, tied to the rock or nailed to the rock. He crops up in mythology as the god of the crossroads, god of cairns. You know, when you're on a walk and you see little cairns telling you which way. In ancient times, he was also the god of crossroads and cairns. So hermeneutics is drawn from that idea of the go-between, the interpretation as that which lies between the object and the subject, so to speak. Gadamer was born in 1900 and died in 2002, so he lived to be 102. I think that's quite interesting because he didn't write his major work until he was 60. Truth and Method. and what a major work it was. I mean, all 600 pages of it, small print. And he still had another 42 years to go, and he was active right up until the end. And I guess in a way, perhaps it's possible in the humanities to carry on building on one's work, and for one's work to deepen and strengthen the more one accrues. But certainly he kept on extending his work and developing it, and developing his central idea, right up until the point of death almost. As I've been getting to know Gadamer, I've realized, I mean, the obvious place to start would be truth and method, which is where I started. And it's a bit of a door jammer, really. Later in life, he'd only written one book, actually, before Truth and Method, and that was his postdoctoral study on Plato. There are now, as you'll see in the reading list, I mean, lots of books that are associated with Gadamer, that are under Gadamer's authorship, but most of them are just collections of addresses he gave or papers he delivered. He worked very much in the discursive mode, the research monologue or even the scholarly monologue, other than Truth and Method, weren't really his genre. And so I think some of the best starting points for those of you who might want to get into Gadamer are, and I think they're both in the references, are two books that are records of his conversations with other philosophers. They're 20, 30 years after having written Truth and Method. He's reflecting upon it in discussion with other philosophers, and they're a very accessible way in. Some formative influences in his life. His mother died when he was very young. His father was a professor, quite an authoritarian character. So he was brought up basically by his stepmother. He had one brother who suffered from a severe illness. His father was away a lot on academic work, so he was alone with his brother and stepmother. His brother was then suddenly incarcerated, institutionalized by his father, which clearly had a profound effect on Gadamer, because now he was more or less just alone with the stepmother, who he didn't particularly get on too well with. And then he went through World War I, of course. A major influence in his life, as with so many of that generation of German scholars on the humanities side, was Heidegger. He came across Heidegger's work just after he'd finished his doctorate, and wanted Heidegger to be his postdoctoral supervisor. And it looked as if Heidegger would do that, and then suddenly Heidegger, as is very characteristic of Heidegger, I think, suddenly did a volte-face and said, no, you're not good enough, I'm not. And that was a great shock to Gadamer. But later Heidegger did decide to take Gadamer on. And that was quite a dependency relationship, I think, between Heidegger and Gadamer. But he finally distanced himself from Heidegger. He didn't break with him, he distanced himself during the Second World War, when, as I'm sure you're all aware, Heidegger embraced fascism in a very overt and very enthusiastic manner. But he didn't break with Heidegger, he just distanced himself from him. And then he, as I say, after the war, in 1960, his book Truth and Method was published, and then his reputation rose fairly rapidly after that, and he lectured internationally a lot and became particularly interested in applying his hermeneutics to professional fields such as education and, in particular, the health professions. So he's got a lot to say to educationists, and perhaps even more to say to health professionals, because he wrote a lot about, he addressed a lot of groups, and those have been put together into books for health professionals. So that's a little potted version of his life. He wasn't like Hannah Arendt, a public intellectual. He doesn't stand out as a public intellectual, as somebody who is pronouncing on the big events of his time. Indeed, if anything, he kept his head rather below the parapet, particularly during the Second World War. I mean, he has been criticised for not standing out more strongly against the Nazi regime. He wasn't called up because of his own ill health. And in a later interview with the philosopher Jonathan Ray, he said, "I believe in conversation so much that even during the war I would converse with Nazis." So, you know, you can look at that two ways. But public intellectual isn't one of those terms that I would necessarily apply to Gadamer. More of a public educator in a sense, perhaps. In truth and myth, I could now move on just very broadly to what I see as some of the major themes in his work. I'll just pinpoint three, which I think are the major ones. And he tends to builds his themes rather around metaphors. So I think you'll have come across these metaphors. I mean, the one is the first one is what he calls the power of prejudice. By prejudice, he means forejudgments. Those judgments that we already bring into the present moment. These, he argues, have a tremendous power. And he goes on to that in Truth and Method. This is for the central arguments of Truth and Method. Is that you can't pretend that you don't have those forejudgments. You can't pretend that you don't have those prior judgments, that you don't have assumptions that are pouring into how you look at the current situation. Your prime intellectual task, he argues, is to reflect upon which of your prejudices are going to be beneficial in the particular inquiry you're conducting, and those which are not going to be particularly beneficial or even counterproductive. This is where he had the long-standing rumbling disagreement with Habermas. They finally they didn't have to make up because they were both such incredibly courteous characters, but I think they finally, towards the end, did begin to understand one another. But Habermas's point was, well, that's not really good enough. Hang on, I mean, what are the procedures whereby you judge whether your prejudices are going to be beneficial or not? Isn't this a recipe for just compounding our prejudices? That would have been Habermas's way of looking at it. But Gadamer kind of stuck to his guns and said, no, the only way in which you can work this through is not by a rigorous set of criteria about your prejudices. You can only test it by conducting the inquiry. But that was the big, really quite well documented Habermas-Gadamer debate, which are actually, it's in the references Gadamer and McCarthy. In that particular book, in the references Gadamer and McCarthy, Understanding and Social Inquiry, that has the Habermas's review of Truth and Method, in which he raises that criticism. I think Habermas's review first came out in 1971 or 72, 10 years later. So Habermas has kind of reflected upon it, and but that's where you would find Habermas's response to Gadamer. So that's one big theme that's kind of woven into Truth and Method. The other theme, and again, this will be a phrase I'm sure you've come across, is the fusion of horizons. He talks about interpretation as well, just that, the fusion of horizons. It's the point of overlap, if you like. So it's not simply a matter of dragging the object of study into my referential zone, nor is it simply a matter of kind of collapsing entirely into the object's world. It's a matter of finding some mediation between the two. I mean, we're in kind of a Vygotsky area here a bit as well, aren't we? There, but I think Gadamer takes it further than Vygotsky, I think, really, because what Gadamer builds a historical dimension in that. He reminds us that as we walk, the horizon is constantly shifting. Our horizon never remains the same. We can never say, we have achieved our fusion of horizons, because we are historical creatures moving through time. Therefore, the fusion of our horizons is not an accomplishment. It is a constant process. Much of his work and much of his intellectual background is focusing on the interpretation of texts. But clearly you could see how this has implications as well for the social sciences generally, where the fusion of horizons becomes an even more complicated notion, I suppose, because the interpreter's horizon is shifting, but the human subject's horizons may be constantly shifting as well. Then the third theme is where truth and method opens. His first section is the problem of method. That's what he calls it, the problem of method. And truth and method, his book, Truth and Method, is an attempt to tackle what he sees as the problem of method. Now he's addressing what he sees as the overriding influence of the natural sciences, and how the natural science modes of inquiry are encroaching upon the humanities as he sees it. So part of the book, in a sense, you can read the book as a polemical defense of the humanities, and in the very first section of the book, he talks about how we set about interpreting art. So he's setting that against scientific modes of inquiry. At this point, I will move more directly to the paper. So most of what I've said wasn't particularly in the paper, but I did want to sort of give you that broader framework and tell you something about Gadamer's life, since perhaps not all of you were aware of that. He wrote his postdoctoral study on Plato, but in Truth and Method, Aristotle plays a very important part in building the framework. And there is a whole section on Aristotle in Truth and Method. Central to the point he's trying to make, and in trying to carve out what he means by interpretation, is a set of distinctions that Aristotle draws between different forms of knowledge, if you like. Theoretical knowledge, which would be judged according to its coherence, if you like. Technical knowledge, or know-how, techne. And this third kind, phronesis, or deliberation. And he uses this distinction to try and as a framework for trying to understand what he means by interpretation, and he allies his notion of understanding or interpretation to Aristotle's notion of deliberation. The crucial point about deliberation is that we do not know what is going to be the result of our deliberations. We deliberate about right action. We deliberate about what is the right thing to do collectively. We cannot enter a deliberation knowing in advance what is going to be the consequence of our deliberation. That is, otherwise it wouldn't be deliberation. By its very nature, we might know. Each of us might have a position, but we don't know what kind of consensus is going to emerge from that deliberation. Totally different from techne, or technical know-how, which is guided by our very strong sense of there being an outcome. If I'm building a ship, everything that I do has to be focused towards a ship that can float well and sail well on the sea or river or whatever. I am guided by that telos, by that end point. Totally different from deliberation. So he tries to use Aristotle's notion of deliberation as a way of explaining what he understands by understanding within the humanities. Is that clear? There's another important point that he hints at, and that I think is tremendously important to us in our situation here. I mean, in a sense, he's pointing to the way in which writing as he is within the humanities in 1960, or writing for the decade before that, but published in 1960, how technical thinking is swamping frenetic thinking. Now, it seems to me this has tremendous implications for what is happening in schools, colleges, and universities today, where modes of assessment operate as if what we're all involved in is techne. So, the whole obsession with goals, targets, outcomes, from a Gadamerian perspective, is hopelessly inappropriate if one is operating in the deliberative mode, because one cannot know what one is going to know until one knows it. One cannot understand what one's going to understand until one has understood it. And he is arguing that that's how the humanities are, and that's how interpretive inquiry is. You can't say what the outcome's going to be. And I think that's, I think that has tremendous relevance to the situation that we probably find ourselves in now. I'm now moving on to the section in my paper, for those who might or might not be following me in that paper, section 3, so beyond the method. So Gadamer works from that position that I've tried to carve out there, to say that there can be no set of rules that will lead us to the point of understanding. This brings in a slightly different line of reasoning that perhaps I should have emphasized earlier. A guiding theme throughout the work is that understanding and application are part of a single process. We do not understand something and then apply it in Gadamer's terms. So that's a complete misunderstanding of understanding. Think that we've understood something and then we simply apply it. all understanding is itself a kind of application. We can only, to understand something is to apply it to ourselves. He's not necessarily taking us down a completely sort of vocational route here. By that he means that unless we can find a connection with that which we're seeking to understand, back to this fusion of horizons idea in a sense, we're not doing this thing called understanding. So understanding necessarily involves what he's calling application. He's saying there can be no set of rules, therefore, that lead us from understanding to application, because application is part of the same process as understanding. He's not there saying that that methods can't be important. Of course they are. I mean, and a key quote of his is, "As tools, methods are always good to have," he says, bottom of page 4, I've got this. "But one must understand where these can be fruitfully used. Methodical sterility is a generally known phenomenon. Applying the method," he continues, "is what the person does who never finds out anything new, who never brings to light an interpretation that has revelatory power." So it is, he concludes, not their mastery of methods, but their hermeneutical imagination that distinguishes truly productive researchers. And what is hermeneutical imagination? It is a sense of the questionableness of something and what this requires of us. I find that a very, very kind of tricky way of putting it. How is it that something addresses us as a question? I want to go on to that in a minute, but I think what he's saying there is that if we can find the very specific question that our object of study is addressing us with, then we are starting this process of application. We are making that connection, and we can only do that by saying, how is this poem by Hopkins, say, speaking to me specifically? What's it asking of me? Because what it's asking of me might be very different from what it's asking of Jan. So we've got to find our own question in whatever it is we're inquiring into. I want to talk a little bit more about questions in a minute, but just to pull out two sort of implications of this movement beyond method that Gadamer is trying to push us towards here. You can see that following that some of the crucial developments in the second half of the 20th century in psychology and indeed in sociology build upon that idea. I mean, if we take Jerome Bruner's pushing of psychology towards the interpretive and very explicit rejection of behaviorist psychology, and carving out that whole area that we now think of as the new psychology, pushing it towards the interpretive mode. Or, I mean, I know Bourdieu is sometimes seen as something of a determinist, but you can also see Bourdieu pushing sociology more towards the interpretive and away from the positivistic, as Gadamer would see it. So it seems to me Gadamer here is, I'm not suggesting that Bourdieu or Bruner were necessarily influenced by Gadamer, although I think Bruner might have been to some extent. But it's part of a similar sort of push towards the interpretive. And I think as well you can see the sort of that sort of shift occurring in the social sciences generally, in the acknowledgement of the importance of a broader range of data sources, for example, or the emphasis on the researcher needing to make explicit their own value position, an acknowledgement that the researcher's or scholar's value position might be an important component of the inquiry in some way. So I think you can see how what Gadamer here is saying about method is part of a general push. So just to sort of sum that up at the top of page 6, Gadamer saw that application is not a consequence of understanding, but a necessary and constitutive element of understanding. And that since understanding is always conducted within particular situations, there can be no universal method governing its application. Each event of understanding is therefore a unique foray into the unfamiliar, the strange and the unintelligible. Particular methods of inquiry may be useful, but only if they're appropriate to the nature of the inquiry and if they're seen as helpful tools that cannot in themselves yield the truth. Truth requires a leap of what he calls the hermeneutical imagination, a leap into the questionableness of things, not things in general, but the thing in itself in all its sort of unaccommodated strangeness, as I put there. So this phrase, the primacy of the question, is Gadamer's. He's saying that all inquiry starts from the question, and no set of rules will get you to the question. That's his crucial point. Having got a question, you might be able to draw in certain tools and methods that you deem to be appropriate, but it's only the hermeneutical imagination, critical self-reflection, that can get you to the point of formulating the question that is your question, given your historical situatedness. That, he says, is what is going on when we try to interpret a text, try to interpret another human being, try to interpret an artwork, or one might argue even tries to interpret a policy document. So if I just think a little bit about the primacy of the question. So this complicated idea, which I mentioned before, understanding begins when something addresses us. This is the first condition of hermeneutics. This reminds me quite a lot of. I don't know if any of you know Edward Said's work, but Edward Said, a great literary critic who died prematurely about 10 years ago, and a Palestinian. But he writes about the need to accept the integrity of any text that we are trying to evaluate, understand, interpret. And Gadamer's saying something very similar here, I think, that although we bring all our own baggage, we've got a text in front of us. I'm using text very generally here. A social situation, a human being, a work of art, a written work that has to be understood in terms of its own in terms of its own historical situatedness. So it's two different sorts of historical situatedness, both of which have to be respected. So he's saying, Gadamer is clear that finding the right question is itself a major hermeneutical task. It's not that we get a question and then we get on with our doctoral study. It's the finding of the question is the whole point. He says, no, there is in science or in life no answer to a senseless question which concerns nothing questionable. What a good or correct, a well-aimed question is, can be corroborated only through its rational testing. We only know the value of a question by what it yields. But, he continues, to find fruitful questions is itself an art. No, an ability which has its own rationality. We practice this art during our whole life. We practice it daily. He at this point draws, to try and explain this process, he draws on the work of an English philosopher called Collingwood. Any of you come across Collingwood? Collingwood died just at the beginning of the Second World War. But before he died, he wrote this very short little book, which is simply called an autobiography, but really is about method. Collingwood was both a philosopher, but he was also an archaeologist. And as an archaeologist, this is one of the examples Collingwood gives in his book. As an archaeologist, I'll start a little bit back from that. I don't know whether any of you happen to know or have seen the Roman remains in Ambleside. Well, they're not really remains. There's a field in Ambleside where there was a fort. Collingwood did one of the major digs there, and he had a big barney with the other archaeologists because they only had 3 weeks for this dig. So he said, we can't just go and scuffle around, see what we can find. We've got to go with a question. That's the only way to do it. We've got to go with a question. And they saw this as him bringing in his prejudices. But he said, no, we've got to look at this carefully beforehand and think what to ask. The crucial question that, having studied previous digs, was something to do with the length of one of the walls, if I remember rightly. On the basis of this, they established that the fort had been much, much, much larger than it had been, which has been more recently corroborated by sort of forensic evidence and things. Sorry, that was a bit of a detour. But Collingwood and Gadamer were kind of ploughing the same furrow in a way, although the one didn't know the other. But at this point, Gadamer does draw on Collingwood. Collingwood also has this example, which Gadamer gives in full. Question. And this is a fruitful question. This is what Gadamer would call a very fruitful question. Why will my car not start? Go to my car, right? I need my car to get from A to B, and the car doesn't start. So the car is presenting me with a very real problem, a real question. You know, how can you get me to start? You know, it's fruitful because it's relevant to my current situation. It's where I am. It's a fruitful question because it implies choices, particular choices that have got to be made, and it implies a way forward. Then Collingwood says, now, I can't sort of sit by, I can't keep asking this question, why doesn't my car, I can't just sort of sit down in the pavement and philosophize about why my car doesn't start. I immediately have to ask another question. So my other question, at this point I don't know anything about cars, by the way, but I think if I got it right, this is Collingwood. So my next question is, could it be the spark plugs? right? So I undo the bonnet, and I'm faced, I think, with 4 spark plugs, something like that. So then that question still leads what now? Okay, so now is it this spark plug? So I've moved from why doesn't my car start to is it something to do with the spark plugs? Is it something to do with spark plug B? So what Collingwood is arguing here is that once you've got a fruitful question, this will lead you through into further questions that are then answered at that level, and may not, in this case they would, but with a more complex sort of inquiry, don't necessarily immediately resolve your big leading question, but will contribute to it. So it seems to me, why I find this useful is this. I think this is how I operate when I'm trying to write something complicated. I mustn't lose sight of what my big lead question is. I have to keep going back to that. But I have to go on all sorts of little detours of following through other little questions. So it's like kind of tentacular roots, or the other way, branching trees. But, and this is Gadamer's point, I think, is you mustn't lose sight of the original fruitful question. That's the thing that's going to kind of see you through. So, I mean, I find this area when I'm working with doctoral students. I mean, I find this can be a kind of real stumbling block. I mean, it's very difficult to say to somebody, I'm sorry, there are no rules here. There's no method. I can't give you a little set of rules. You've got to get into the, if it's a text, you've got to see what other texts that text is speaking against and speaking within. You've got to get into the conversation, as he would put it. You've got to get into the conversation of the thing that you're trying to understand. And from that will gradually emerge the question that this is putting to you, or that you need to put to it, whichever way you want to look at it. And that is, I mean, his word, a leap of the hermeneutical imagination, is absolutely, it is a leap. It's like a Kierkegaardian leap of faith, really. I think, sorry, this is another slight digression perhaps, but I mean, in some ways, that's perhaps one might think that's, I might be wrong here, but you could say that might be rather the difference between perhaps an undergraduate final year dissertation and a PhD, in that the undergraduate dissertation, you might need much more scaffolding at that level, whereas at the PhD level, yeah, sure, you need some scaffolding, but there's much greater emphasis on what Gadamer is calling, I think, the leap of the hermeneutical imagination. Just finally, then, I mentioned that having finished Truth and Method, he then moved into what he called, rather confusingly, I think, he decided to concentrate on what he called applied hermeneutics. I say that's slightly confusing because he's already argued and continues to argue that understanding is application. So, I mean, all hermeneutics is applied in a sense, but he's wanting to look at it very specifically in relation to the health professionals and education professionals. I think this does interestingly lead through, I mean, I don't know whether any of you were involved or touched on a lot of the literature around the new professionalism, but it does seem to me that this is where it leads. He grasps, I think, that there have been really significant social and technological changes that he was living through in what by now is the last quarter of the 20th century. Knowledge explosion, and he's trying to, in some ways, think how that relates to professional groups, and build on his theory of understanding for that. So the question is, what does this tell us about the way in which teachers might relate to students? What does it tell us about pedagogy? Crucially, what might it tell us about the role of the healer, the doctor, in that process? And he uses what I think is a really wonderful image here of tree sawing. I'm sort of halfway down page 8. He says this is how he sees skilled professional practitioners working with those in their care. As one partner draws the blade, the other follows in concert, so that the whole sawing process constitutes an internally unified configuration in which the respective movements of the tree cutters fuse to become a single rhythmic flux of movement. Now, I don't know whether any of you have had the misfortune of having to saw a tree or whatever, but what he's getting at here is if one person exerts too much pressure, it just doesn't work. It's got to be quite relaxed. It's got to find its own rhythm. If one person digs too hard, it throws the whole thing. You've got to work in unison. Now he's saying that's how he understands the relation between doctor and patient. That's how he understands the relation between lecturer and supervisee, or tutor and supervisee. This kind of working together. It's another. He argues a lot through metaphor, and the metaphor obviously has a lot in common with the fusion of horizons image that he uses as well. But I mean, when I first read this, I thought, yeah, that's absolutely it. That's how I try to work with my doctoral students, say, or master students on their dissertations. Kind of, I'd say, I think I understand what you mean. Let me reflect it back to you. Is this what you're trying to say? Well, no, John, it's not really what I'm trying to say. This is more what I'm trying to say. And gradually working towards a sort of shared understanding, but in harmony, and neither one imposing too much on the other. I just think it's a lovely image for getting at that. And of course, what he's pointing to here as well, in what's better framed, in the healing process, is that kind of relationship ought to be occurring as well between doctor and patient. So in this process, professional judgment becomes supremely important, and it's specifically about judging how my knowledge might be applicable in this particular situation. And he has one wonderful essay on what we would now think of as general practitioners, arguing that there are two quite distinct sets of judgments which a general practitioner needs to make, both of which are extremely complicated. One of which is diagnosis, and he kind of tries to show how that needs to be done negotiatively by the person explaining the pain, or whatever. But then there is also a further judgment about treatment. And the second set of judgments about treatment doesn't necessarily just simply flow out of the first, because there might be things that I understand about the person whom I'm prescribing for, which would make certain kinds of treatment less beneficial than others. So he talks about the different sorts of judgments that need to be made. And he talks less about teaching, but there again, I mean, Richard Pring has a wonderful essay on teaching where he argues that there are two crucial requirements, and I think this point of Richard's is really quite Gadamerian. That the teacher clearly must understand the structure of that which they're teaching. They have to be on the inside of whatever it is they're teaching. They have to have authority within that. They have to know how the bits hang together. That's one bit. But they also need to have an understanding of their students, which enables them to make the right connections. And both require complicated sets of judgments. I just finish by really reading my last paragraph. So Gadamer's work undoubtedly raises questions regarding the nature of professional practice, as I've just touched on there. Within education and the health sectors. And there you would really need to start with some of his later texts if you wanted to get to that. I think it also has implications for thinking about how we write. And as it were, whether we simply are using writing, if we have a view of writing which is simply I've understood something, and now I'm kind of just going to report it. It's simple, I've understood it. I'm just going to report it. That's it. Rather like, I'm just going to write it up. Rather than an idea of writing as part of the hermeneutical process itself. And I mean, it might be this. It might be the kind of writing I do, or it might be the kind of person I am. But I find that although I always start with a skeleton, so to speak, and a framework, that framework is constantly changing and shifting, and I'm understanding that which I'm writing about in the process of writing it. So I've left a few questions at the end, but we don't need to necessarily address those questions, but they are the sorts of questions that I would like to leave you with. Thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Well, thank you very much. So, any questions to start?
Yeah, I have a question on how can we overcome relativism within Gadamer's account of the method and truth, because it seems to me like sometimes you might end up being relativistic if you're just tied up to your history and your own prejudices. So that means there will be discontinuities within history itself. Is history for Gadamer like a continuous movement, or is it like every history and every tradition should stand separate from the other?
I think he's saying that we are the makers of history, in a sense. I mean, it's a bit Hegelian that history is there in our consciousness, and we are formed by history, but and we are the product of history, and we carry history forward. But events are what we make of them and how we understand them. I'm not quite sure how that relates to your question about relativism. Would you like to just elaborate that a little?
Yeah, I mean, like, if there is a text that is revealed in the past, and I would like now to interpret this text in the present. So, shall I apply only the interpretation of the text in the past to the present, or shall I just ignore it and try to develop my own theory of interpretation or dealing with the present reality?
Well, one school of thought would argue that you can judge the validity of the text insofar as it, by taking it back to the authorial intention. So a text means what its author meant it to mean, as it were. So then the task is to infer from the text the author's intentionality. And insofar, and then you will judge the validity of your interpretation with regard to how well you have done that. So that there, the prime meaning lies between the text and the author, so to speak. Gadamer would reject that. But he would also certainly reject the idea that a text is whatever I want it to mean. He would argue that the validation of my reading of a text is never finished. It keeps on deepening. And he talks about, I forgot what his phrase is, but anticipated meaning. And the finding of meaning in things is always a process of anticipation. I mean, if we take a truth and method, for example, I mean, I can't read the thing. I hesitate whether anybody could just read the thing through from beginning to end and say, I've got it. I know exactly what he meant. It's a constant process of, well, that section would suggest to me that it means something like that, and as you move on through, then the meaning deepens. Or to switch metaphors, you begin to get a feel for the wood as a whole as you get to know each of the trees. So validation then becomes a constant process of anticipation. And so he quite explicitly argues against those who claim that he is a relativist. And that was another critique of truth and method. He argued, no, that I'm not a relativist. It's just that I see validation as a process rather than a one-off thing that can be judged against very clear criteria. I'm not sure whether I answered your question there, but
yeah, sure. Thank you.
Sorry, this is a question. I didn't know anything about Gadamer until just now. So, you were talking about understanding it being a kind of application, and I was just writing down the question to myself: is understanding then a kind of doing? Just as you said, understanding is not something we do. So, could you expand on that? How is it an application but not something that we do?
yeah, I don't. He's not necessarily. He's not. I just forgot the. He's not necessarily arguing for a pedagogy that's all built around action. I don't think. So I don't think he does necessarily mean that understanding is doing. But understanding can only be achieved by applying it to our own situation. our own, in its historic situatedness. So it's application in that sense.
So would you say understanding is then a kind of process, and a process that can only be achieved through an action, although understanding itself is not an action? Would that make sense?
I think he would be seeing it more in terms of certainly a process, but he would see that process more in terms of conversation, not less doing and more conversation. He would say that understanding is an ongoing process of conversation. So when you start that conversation, you might have very little to say because you're trying to suss out that conversation. You're trying to understand where everybody's coming from. Then you might, go for a little intervention. But as you become more authoritative, if you like, regarding the parameters of the conversation, what the conversation's about, what various positions are, you begin to find a niche within that conversation. So he sees inquiry more in those terms. So what we might think of in technical terms of, we might say to students or ourselves, we've got to read around the subject. That wouldn't just be a sort of little technical thing that one's got to do in order to jump through some hurdle. Gadamer would see that as being absolutely fundamental to the process. He would think of that more in terms of entering the conversation. I think that's why. I mean, if you conceive of understanding in that way, a long life's a pretty lucky thing to have. Going back to him being 102, because if you've got 100 years to work your way onto the inside of a complex, highly complex conversation on the philosophy of knowledge and understanding, then you are by nature going to become kind of more authoritative within that discourse, which might not be the same if you're a physicist. I don't know, or it might or it might not. I don't know. So.
From quite a practical point of view, and I was thinking about the question you asked me about how I've written my methods chapter. For writing journal articles on PhD thesis, how do you approach writing a method section in this way?
Right. Remember, he doesn't say methods aren't important. They have their place. So he's not completely dismissing methods. But he's just saying that methods don't lead inquiry. Well, he's saying among other things that methods don't lead inquiry. That the methods emerge from the question, and the question can't be discovered through method. So, in a sense, I see that as a very important methodological point. And I think methodology chapters should be methodological rather than just a list of methods that I might have used. So in that sense, I mean, although Truth and Method tries to put methods in their place, so to speak, and not let them take over, it is a very important work of methodology. So, and that's not very helpful in answer to your question. What I would say is that some of the best methodology chapters that I have read in doctoral students actually tell it as it is. And therefore they're extremely helpful to other researchers. Or put it another way, some of the worst methodology sections in papers or the worst methodology chapters in PhD simply state the plan that people start the design, the research design, the methods. That's it. And there isn't any real critical reflection on how all that developed, on the messiness of it all, on the muddiness of it all, of how actually there was a real false start because it had nothing to do with the bloody spark plugs at all. It had to do with something else. Do you see what I mean? And I mean, I've read some wonderful methodology chapters where students have felt emboldened by their supervisor to write up methodology in that way, because that's real methodological. It's so easy as a student to think, I'm confessing that something went wrong. I'm sort of coming clean about these terrible things that went wrong, when in fact everything's bound to go wrong. Well, not everything, but things go wrong. Things are messy. That's what inquiry is all about, and that's one of the things Gadamer's saying. I think Gadamer is kind of freeing us up to be able to be honest about the muddle that constitutes real understanding. So my advice would be, I'm not for one moment arguing against rigor or clarity or anything like that, but I think he would be pointing towards some discussion of underlying assumptions, not just techniques and methods, and some critical reflection on not what went wrong, but what was unexpected, what was surprising, things like that.
Discussion about the importance of the question is quite sort of close to my heart at the moment. But what I was wondering, listening to you, I can see quite a sort of, much of it seems quite, a good question leading to something practical. What I'm interested in is, does he say much about ideas of originality, sort of new things, as it were, as distinct from something that's totally practical? Your car example is quite a practical example. How to get my car going.
Yeah.
Does he raise questions about well, I don't know, there might be a new way of starting the car or something? Does he raise questions of that kind? Discuss that sort of thing?
I don't know whether he discusses it explicitly, but isn't that to some extent implicit in the emphasis he gives to it having to be my question? That there's no sort of there's no big general consensual question which we can find. It's got to be my question. I'm sorry to keep going back to Hopkins, but I've just been reading recently. I mean, if I'm reading The Windhover, great sonnet by Hopkins, my question would be different from yours, and therefore the interpretation of that poem will be ever so slightly different. We're going to agree on rhyme scheme and where stresses fall and things like that, but our interpretation might be different. So I thought that perhaps it's implicit. And isn't that the really difficult thing with a doctoral study, or indeed any book? Getting the thing that spark that gives you the connection to what you're writing about. And clearly that PhD student.
How does one assess kind of phonetic understanding? So if we were to teach our students in a phonetic sort of way, emphasizing phronesis, not episteme or techne, how do we assess them at the end and say, actually, they've done a good job or not? For example, if they write a reflective piece, reflective journal, how do we mark that? How do we approach that?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose some of those formative assessment devices, like ongoing diary accounts or logs or things like that, I suppose they are attempts to kind of tackle that a bit. Surely what you are assessing is if you're working in that way, you would be assessing the student's capacity for critical reflection upon their own learning. This sounds terribly conservative, but I can't think of a better way of doing that than the essay. The essay literally means an attempt. You know, it is an going back to the current state of higher education. Of course, I mean, the assessment of extended pieces of prose at undergraduate level is very time costly, isn't it? So a lot of undergraduate courses, it seems to me, insofar as I'm sort of a bit anecdotal this, but are moving more and more to kind of tick listy kind of so what you would be seeking to assess would be a growth in the capacity to be self-reflective about the process of learning itself, and then you would need to think of the kinds of evidence that would help inform such a judgment. I don't know whether any of you know of somebody called, long dead now, happened to be my doctoral supervisor, Lawrence Stenhouse. Wrote a wonderful little book published in 1976, a book called Introduction to Curriculum Research and Development, where he argues what he calls the process model. And there he does say that there can actually be no better assessment of the process model of curriculum than the essay. The essay in the sense of essay, an attempt.
Right, well, any more questions? I've got time for one quick one. Not that I don't think you can really do a quick question. Doesn't lend himself.
No,
Now it's time for a soundbite. Oh, sorry.
Yes. As we understand the object, is there a method to organize this understanding and application, this relationship or conversation, the question and answer dialect? Can be organized by a method? I mean, what could Gadamer say about this? Do we need a method to organize the process of interaction between understanding and application?
I'll try and be quick. Got my head around it. He sees understanding and application as a unified process. So he certainly doesn't suggest that there is a method for. As far as I can understand, as far as I know, he doesn't argue for a method for ascertaining the relation between understanding and application in the sense that he means it. No. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about that, but.
Well, I'd just like to thank you again very much for such a thoughtful, I think we'll all go away and be musing over our method for some time. Just a couple of small announcements. A copy of the video of this session will be available from the EdRes website shortly. So if you want to refresh your memory and you're still puzzling over something. The room here is available until 2:30 if people want to continue chatting about it. And the next seminar will take place in this room on Wednesday the 7th of June, and that will be Dr. Akendu Sen, who's a visiting academic with us from Monash University, Malaysia. Title to be announced, but I'm sure it's going to be smashing.